Hi, I'm JP Noodleman, and welcome to my channel. It's been a while, but I figure I'd like to return with a look closer at world building for your D&D campaign settings. And the topic I want to go over with world building today is history. Probably the hardest thing for a world builder is to have a sense of history to their world. And one of the things I like to do is the use of an unreliable narrator and uncertain history. And this is sort of different from, say, Tolkien's world. So the great sort of division you could think of between an unreliable and a reliable narrator of history is Tolkien versus George R.R. Martin. Now, in George R.R. Martin's work, everything you know as a reader about the history of the world of A Song of Ice and Fire comes to you from the perspective of people uh, recalling what they've heard or what they've learned in the context of that world. And that adds an air of this might not be totally true, or this might be complete fabrication, this might not have any basis in evidence at all. So, for example, the idea the first men are descended from the Ibanese. That is a story that is told by a few people, but there's no 100% set in stone nature to that bit of information. That could just be hearsay, that could just be a scholar's, fanciful theory. There's no 100% this is definitely true. This exists in opposition to, say, Tolkien. Now, for Tolkien, the history and mythos of the world of Middle Earth is kind of absolutely known. We know about Morgoth's fall. We know that it was Melkor, then became Morgoth. We know about the Silmarils. We know about the One Ring. We know about how it was crafted. We know what order each race came into existence. We know the genealogy of various kings. We know, who were who were the first men to take the rings. We know what effects the rings had on the dwarves and the elves. We know exactly where the world came from. Eru Iluvatar is absolutely a thing that absolutely exists and is absolutely responsible for the existence of the world of Middle Earth. Uh, there's no way you could contest that point without being a crazy person in the world of Middle Earth. But in George R.R. Martin's world, someone could say that that idea that the first men of Westeros are descended from Ibonese is horseshit. You can contest that point within the context of the world, and you can't do that in Tolkien's world. No one can say, well, I don't think Morgoth actually did anything, or Morgoth even existed. It's just a matter of fact. Sauron is a matter of fact. Uh, everything is sort of just a matter of fact. And while I love Tolkien, and in many ways I draw a lot of inspiration from him, I think that's a major weakness of his world, and it's a weakness to follow that model when doing your world building. And that's why, even though I might build a world that has lots of different races and has many Tolkien-esque elements to it, I tend to follow George R. R. Martin's method when it comes to writing history, and that is to always present the history from differing perspectives and to present them with an air of controversy about them, that not all of this is agreed upon, or this is from the perspective of one scholar in the context of the world. Um, the reasons I do this are really, you could summarize it in two. The first is that it's really easy to write. I don't have to write a comprehensive history. I just have to write what the people in context know about history, which most dungeon masters, most world builders for D&D are building quasi-medieval settings or something set in a kind of ancient historical epic that has a lot of texture and flavor to it that would remind one of, say, the late Iron Age or the Dark Ages of medieval Europe or something like that, where knowledge isn't widespread. So it's kind of easy to replicate that with just, well, this is what these people believe, and since the players are in a certain area, it's not likely they're going to go out and want to learn the entire history of the world they're playing in. They just want sort of the relevant tidbits for the story. So it's really easy to write. You can just have according to blank X happened, though it's not for sure known. You know, um, a player could ask, what is the origin of these ruins? And you could say, well, the locals say they come from blank. And, depending on how high they roll on the knowledge check or whatever check you're using, depending on the rule system you're using, the player would know, what the locals think, but they might not know for certain, like as a guaranteed fact, where these things come from. So what you could do is you have that for sort of the basic, they pass the DC, so they know what many people are saying about these ruins or what is commonly believed. Say they roll a natural 20 and you can give them an in-depth, like, well, blank group of people say these ruins were built by, the Sun Elves or something, and then another group of scholars say, no, 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 it was actually built by this dragon, and maybe there's little details about the ruins that they learned through a natural 20 or something like that. That's what I tend to do, and the other reason I do it, other than it feels easier to write, is it's easy to reuse your world. So, what I mean by that is the fact that facts aren't set in stone means you can tell lots of different types of stories. So, in one campaign, a historical empire is seen as good, but in another campaign, they're seen as evil, and this is when new facts and new information comes out because the players don't know for certain anything about this previous fallen empire. They just know the key bullet points. A, they were really good at magic. B, they instantly were vaporized one day through unknown means. And the players, um, especially if you're using the same player group from campaign to campaign to campaign set in the same world, maybe, spacing out the time period of each campaign, or maybe it's, one sequentially after another. Um, this allows you to sort of reuse certain lore without having to always have this player, this historic figure or kingdom or empire was always good and did always good things and always did these great things. You can kind of explore different layers of history, and perhaps maybe the empire that one ethnic group within your uh, world thinks was good, you're in another and it turns out they're bad, and it's not necessarily because the people you're playing as have like a different alignment, although I don't use alignment, but that's a topic for another video. Um, you can have the facts of a previous campaign be fundamentally wrong, or the assumptions that the players had while playing in that campaign be wrong in the next campaign. Whereas it would be kind of weird in a Tolkien-esque fantasy to have Eru Iluvatar turn out to actually have been the bad guy. I mean, you could do that, and that might be some fun fan fiction, although, every Tolkien fan, myself included, would just cringe at the idea. But still, you could do that. So those are my two main reasons why I think it's advantageous to do this. And I'll throw in a third reason. And the third reason is just that it makes the world seem like it has more texture to it than you could realistically create. Now, Tolkien's world does have that. Like, all that information gives you a sense that there's so much going on in this world, and you're only getting a very tiny amount. But you could amplify that effect by having the information the players get be uncertain. So what that means is much like real world history isn't known for certain, like nobody knows for certain what caused the Bronze Age collapse. There's books like 1177 BCE, the year civilization collapsed, and there's lots of other scholarship about that time period, but it's sort of a mystery that, in one campaign you could have some indication that the ruins are because of some volcanic apocalypse, or another tsunamis, or another some magical catastrophe or war or whatever. You can present all these different layers, and you avoid the difficulty of having to have for sure knowledge of everything that's ever happened in your world. So I like it to do it for that reason too, because in many ways it simulates real world history where not every single historical fact is 100% known. We don't know every detail of the past. We don't know just and that lack of knowledge, you can simulate in your campaign world by having uncertain narrators of history. Um, that isn't to say this isn't without pitfalls. Now, I mean, the first pitfall is if you're trying to exactly create a Tolkien-esque high fantasy, high magic world, it gets a little bit harder to do this kind of um, world building with uncertain history or uncertain narrators. And the main reason is, like, for example, long lived races. So if in your world elves live to be 1,000 years, 10,000 years, you know, history becomes a lot better to keep track of when there's somebody living who can recall it. You know, um, recent American history is so easy to recall because not only are there a lot of written sources, but also there's just a lot of people currently alive who remember the 1960s. So the 1960s in America are well known, whereas the 1920s a lot less so because there's less people around who were there, even though it's well documented. Or say 1776, a lot less people could read or write back then, so there's less documents. But also there's nobody around today who was there who can give us, an exact description of what George Washington was like. And, you know, if you have, say, elves who live to, I think in standard D&D, they can live to be, I don't know, 10,000 years, let's say. Or if you're in Tolkien, they're immortal. They never die. Uh, it's functionally impossible without, making the elves forgetful. Um, or even just dwarves living to be centuries old can affect this. So when I do create fantasy worlds that have more than just the race of human, which I'm currently working on anyway, I prefer to use. I not use. I prefer to restrict the age of the races. So I don't let elves live to be 10,000 years old because realistically, that never comes up in a campaign anyway. I mean, most campaigns don't cover that kind of span of time, and most players don't know how to really accurately roleplay somebody who's lived 1,000, 2,000, 10,000 years. And so, I don't know. I think there's something to be said for maybe just saying elves live to be, yeah, 150 if they keep themselves in good health. Maybe 200 if they're really lucky and they're really, they won the genetic lottery. And, dwarves the same way. Maybe just give them a human lifespan and say there's some other advantage to being a dwarf. Maybe they're just really strong. Uh, my setting, I tend to be dwarves are really strong, humans are really healthy, and elves are naturally good at magic. And that's sort of the main distinction uh, between them, other than their obvious appearance, with one being short and one being pointy-eared. Um, the other possible pitfall if you're trying to do a uncertain narrator would be whether or not the gods in your universe are immortal, which pretty much always gods are considered to be immortal, but also if gods are really active. So in my setting, the gods are quite a bit more like Martin and A Song of Ice and Fire, with, it's possible to be an atheist in my world because there's no certainty as to whether or not the gods exist. Part of this is because I don't use 5th edition or 3.5 or Pathfinder or any of the standard commonly used D&D um, rule books. I use what's called low fantasy gaming, and I'll provide a link to that rule set in the description. Uh, that system pretty much simplifies magic, and there's only one magic using class, and it's just called magic user. So there is no cleric, and there's no like delineation between divine and arcane magic. It's just magic. It's just supernatural magical power. And that kind of rule system kind of allows for that sort of world building. Whereas I think in 5th edition it'd be very hard because you have domain powers to think about, and literal proof that both that the gods exist and they can commune with certain individuals. So if you're going to do this kind of system, you might want to tweak how easy it is to get information from the gods. Maybe the gods, they'll grant magical powers if you're using 5th edition, but they don't necessarily tell you anything, or they don't give clear answers about the past. So somebody can't, in theory, go to a god and say, hey, what happened on X date 540 years ago. Other than those two things, I think, if you restrict magical means of knowing for sure what happened in the past and you consider cutting down on the ages of various races, or even, you could keep them at their ages, but you're going to have a much longer span of time for your campaign setting. So instead of one epic being, 3, 4,000 years, it has to be like 30, 40, 50, 60,000 years. So that way, multiple generations of elves could have lived and died, and there's no elf remaining who lived to see this time period. So you got to watch the long-lived races, and you got to watch the ability to use magic to find out what accurately happened in the past. But if you can work around those two, or do what I do and just use a different rule system that bypasses that whole sticky situation altogether, you can create a world that will seem very uh, lively, very, very rich, very well developed without having to put a whole lot of work into it. Because you aren't having to know every detail about your world. You can just, invent the name of some scholar from somewhere, according to the priest Basil of whereversville, this is what these ruins are about. And he's currently, like the most well-known scholar of this time period or this era, or according to this ancient surviving document from this era, this is what happened, or this is what this is, or this is mentioned in X document. So you can invent various fictional books in your world that are like the sole surviving manuscripts that describe this era. And as a fun thing, you could even have those manuscripts be written centuries after the events they describe, so the players are even less certain about the information. But, those are just my thoughts. That's personally how I world build. Part of that might be because in real life I'm getting a master's degree in history, so maybe that sort of bleeds out into my world building, and I really love the study of history, particularly ancient and medieval history. And its shaky reliability in some ways makes for good storytelling because, while the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle or the works of the Venerable Bede are interesting to read, you are pretty certain as a scholar that this information isn't 100% true. You know, the way he's describing it both comes from his perspective. Uh, the writing is written for a specific audience and they're going to want to hear a certain thing. So you could have that in your world building. So the documents that the players have access to are all written by somebody to honor a specific king. So, some past king may be presented as a good person, but the players along the way find evidence that no, actually, he was not a very good person. He just had very good propaganda. And, that can add spice and zest to your world building that, a straight, absolute set in stone history really just can't do. And really set in stone histories aren't realistic, so not that realism is necessary for a D&D world, and I don't want to be one of those people that says you have to have realistic everything. Um, make the world as you wish it. But if you want to like have this kind of flavor and texture to your world, this is a very easy way to add it. And let me know what you think. Let me know how you world build in the comments. I would love to know what your style is or what your thoughts are, and I look forward to reading and discussing with you.